If you like history anyway, we have a specific Cold War class which focuses on this topic in particular. It's a pretty interesting moment, and it's pretty cool. And all of the best movies of the 1980s focus on the Cold War as like the subplot. Let's open it. What's that? Huh? You're agreeing? Yeah. Thank you. Not like Maria, who just tries to disagree for the sake of being contrarian and obnoxious. Yeah. I know, right? Let's open in prayer. If you'll join me, we'll begin in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Take, Lord, and receive all my liberty, my memory, my understanding, and my entire will. All I have and call my own, you have given all to me. To you, Lord, I return it. Everything is yours. Do with it what you will. Give me only your love and your grace. That is enough for me. Amen. And the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, we have 5 objectives today. We had a lot of ground to cover today. You should be able to explain the breakdown in relations between the United States and the Soviet Union after the war. During World War II, the Soviet Union was our ally. We fought on the same side. We were on the same teamsy. But right away, it became pretty clear that this alliance would not stand. There's an old phrase in politics. They say that war makes strange bedfellows. People who would not be friends can agree to be friends during a time of war. But as soon as World War II is over, the friendship breaks down between the United States and the Soviet Union. You should be able to summarize the steps taken to contain Soviet influence. Right away, we began to get really mistrustful of the way the Soviets will use their power and influence on their neighbors and abroad. And we'll talk about how the United States reacts to the growing presence of the Soviet Union. We should be able to explain how conflicts over Germany increased the fear of Soviet aggression. Germany in the years after World War II is handled much differently than the way we handled it after World War I. It's a very different approach to handling a country that was an aggressor nation, but we'll talk about how new aggressions use Germany as their field of battle in the Cold War. You should explain how communists came to power in China. We'll do a little bit of Chinese history today. I think it's a super interesting story that I don't think a lot of Americans know very well. So we'll talk about the role of Chinese communism and how the United States reacted to that, like what our policy was. And that will set us up for the events of the Korean War, sometimes considered the forgotten war in American history. We're going to basically do the whole war today in class. If we get there. I think we're going to get there. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 1. The United States and the Soviet Union had very different ambitions for the future. In the years after World War II, we basically began to approach the problems of the world differently. In the United States, let's start in communism. Under Soviet communism, the government controlled all the property and all the economic activity. I think I'd used an example of this class of like how collective farming works and how some people are a farmer and then the government takes it away and Stalin runs your farm. Like you are the farmer, but Stalin owns your farm. It wasn't just farming. Basically everything worked like that. And the government controlled all of the economic activity. In the United States, people control the economic activity. If you want to go start a business, you can. 12 years ago, my wife and I decided to start a business. We opened our t-shirt shop, and we just did it by buying a press and telling people, hey, we print t-shirts now. You can just start a business and go do it. In the Soviet Union, the government did all of the t-shirt printing. You could be a t-shirt printer, but you had a government job, and the government would tell you how many shirts to print and what it needed to look like. In the American system, voting by people elected a president and a Congress from competing political parties. I mean, we have our 2 major parties, the Republicans and Democrats, but there's a handful of other minor parties, and you can pick any of them. Under communism, there was one political party. It was the Communist Party. And if you wanted, there were voting, but all of your votes were basically which communist you were picking. There was no marketplace of ideas, no opposing parties. The United States looks at Stalin as the leader. We said, well, we dealt with Stalin during World War II, but we do not trust him. One of the reasons we don't trust him is because for a time, Stalin and Hitler had a pact, the Nazi-Soviet pact that led to the end of Poland. They're like, that would still be a pact if Hitler wasn't the one to break it, like that they would still be allies if it wasn't for just you shouldn't make deals with Hitler. So we didn't trust Stalin, and in some ways, the Americans and the Soviets actually became more suspicious of each other during the war than they had been before. Stalin resented the way the Americans didn't jump out and attack the Nazis in Germany sooner. The way that we fought through North Africa and up the Italian peninsula before moving into Germany itself. Stalin said that basically America left the Soviet Union to go do all the fighting against the Nazis. Which it is. Soviet Union lost more people than anybody. Stalin resented the Allies' delay in attacking the Germans in Europe. Relations got even worse when Stalin realized the United States had developed an atomic bomb but have not told the rest of the world. They're like, really? You wouldn't tell your allies this? That you're creating a tool that could destroy the Earth? Like, shouldn't your allies know? We're on the same team here. So relations worsened. In spite of these problems, there was a hope for peace. And the hope for peace came from the United Nations. And on April 25th, 1945, representatives from 50 countries met in San Francisco to establish the peacekeeping body known as the United Nations. The United Nations was the successor to the League of Nations, which happens after World War I, but was basically worthless. The UN has a more stronger deliberative body to it, where the countries can interact better. It creates a Security Council that runs over the decisions of the UN and has permanent members of the Security Council, including the Soviet Union, that was just always going to be a member of the Security Council. They were always going to get a strong voice. The United States, also a permanent member. Today, there is no more Soviet Union. Russia is still a member of the Security Council. They just permanently are. There's a few other countries. The Security Council is like the Senate of the UN. They're the ones with really the power. And a few countries get to be permanently on it. Ironically, even though the United Nations was intended to promote peace, it soon became a new arena for the U.S. and the Soviet Union to rival over each other as both sides tried to use the UN to spread their influence. Okay, let's remember how Truman became president. Harry Truman had been Roosevelt's vice president in 1940? I'm losing my mind here. 42. In 1942, he becomes 44th. There we go. In 1944, he becomes Roosevelt's vice president when Roosevelt is reelected for his fourth term. Roosevelt was dying, though, and didn't see the completion of a year. Truman becomes the vice president when Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945. He had only served as vice president for a few months before Roosevelt's death, and they did not get along. They didn't have a friendship. Truman didn't know anything about really governing. He didn't know anything about prosecuting the war. He's basically handed the keys to the White House and told, hey, we have an atomic bomb. A lot of Americans doubted Truman's ability to serve as president. A lot of people said, like, I don't know about Truman. We elected Roosevelt, and we just expected Roosevelt to be the president. This is not uncommon, by the way. President dies, vice president takes over, and people are like, we really sure this is the guy? It's a very normal thing in American politics that people distrust the vice president's ability to be president. But Truman was honest, and he was refreshingly honest to Americans. He had that Midwestern sensibility. He's a Kansas City guy. He just seems like he's down to earth and connected, spoke a regular language, and people connected to him really quick. He was also willing to make tough decisions, and people admired that a lot. Subpoint D. Truman's test as a diplomat, though, Truman had been a U.S. senator and a federal judge, but he's not a diplomat. But his first test as a diplomat came in July of 1945. The war is still going on when the big three, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, met at one more wartime conference. We've seen a lot of these kinds of pictures with leaders of the countries all sitting in, easy chairs as they pose for photos on it. But this one's a little different than the other ones. Roosevelt is missing. They're still sitting. I guess they keep the tradition of sitting in a chair. They put Truman in there. Stalin is the same. He's older, but the same old Stalin. But then also Churchill is different. Churchill was voted out of office during World War II. It sometimes surprises people because Churchill is such an instrumental character, but he was voted out of office during World War II. He was getting to be an old man, and his political party lost office. And so this guy here on the left with the bald head, his name is Clement Attlee, and he's serving as Great Britain here at this Potsdam conference, which was all about trying to shape what the world is going to look like after World War II. At Yalta, which was the last conference we talked about in our last unit, Stalin had promised Roosevelt that he would allow free elections. He would allow free elections in all of the countries that the Soviet Union was picking up. In places like Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe that the Soviets ended up occupying, Stalin had promised Roosevelt that he would allow free and fair elections in all of them. And it was not really clear that he was going to keep that promise now that it wasn't Roosevelt. To continue growing, Americans wanted markets and businesses in Eastern Europe. They wanted to see like the stake of economy, of democracy continuing to grow. They wanted to be able to sell goods in Eastern European countries. So what's in the Soviets' interest? The Soviets tightened their grip on Eastern Europe. They emerged from World War II as an economically and militarily strong nation. It's kind of hard to remember, but when Stalin took power in 1924, the Soviet Union was not strong at anything. They were like little tiny fiddler on the roof kind of farms. It was not like a unified anything. But Stalin, from 1924 to 1945, turns the Soviet Union into the second strongest industrial power on earth. They really emerge as one of the victors of World War II. They're one of the winners. They've picked up new territory. Their economy is going great. And Stalin is a major player. The Soviet Union, though, had also suffered heavy devastation on its own soil. The Nazis fought as far as Stalingrad. And as a result, the Soviets lost at least 20 million people killed in the war. 20 million people killed in the war, probably half of whom were civilians. As a result, the Soviets felt like they deserved Eastern Europe. They were on the winning side, and they'd paid huge casualties to get there. Furthermore, they wanted to make sure they could stop invasions from coming into them again. So, I'm kind of losing my spot here in the line. Truman felt the United Industries. Did I have one slide in there twice? Come on, Wahlberg. Okay, so the Soviet Union, militarily strong. The United States, economically strong and militarily strong. World War II, I think most conventional economic historians say World War II is what got us out of the Great Depression. Put everybody back to work. New industries needed to work as fast as they can. World War II probably broke the Great Depression far more than the New Deal ever did. More than they'll do. So the United States emerges with a strong economy, comes out of the wreckage. The Soviet Union emerges as a strong country coming out of the wreckage. Stalin had taken Poland. Remember, Poland was divided. One side was Nazi and one side was Soviet. Well, the Nazis lost. The Soviets basically take all of Poland by 1945. Czechoslovakia, this had been the part that was the Sudetenland that Germany had claimed first. Hitler had claimed first, and then Hitler took all of Czechoslovakia. Well, when the Nazis surrendered in Czechoslovakia, they surrendered to the Soviets. Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. These countries are still independent countries, but they pick up a new name for them. They call them the satellite countries. A satellite's that thing in space, right, that like connects your cell phone, so you have your GPS. But a satellite is more importantly, like it's a more scientific term, is the thing that orbits around its body, right, orbits around its center. And these countries become known as the satellite countries. They're not the Soviet Union. They are independent, but they are definitely in the Soviet Union's orbit. Like they are definitely tied to the Soviet Union. They call them the satellite countries. So Stalin then sets up communist-style countries here, but also in Albania, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Poland, become known as the satellite countries. And in 1946, Stalin gave a speech announcing, this was kind of like Stalin's going to draw the line between American-style capitalism and Soviet-style communism. He says that they're incompatible. They're incompatible. They just want two different goals. That capitalism speaks for the capitalist and the rich, and communism speaks for the powerless. I think Americans would say kind of the opposite, that in capitalism, everyone gets to choose their own freedom and their own ways for themselves, and in communism, the government chooses everything for you, and that's not freedom and choice. But basically saying they are incompatible systems, and I think implying the Soviet Union expects to be at a war soon with the United States. And it's not just a war of territory, it's not just a war of turf, it's a war of ideology. It's a way of seeing the world, of seeing your ability and your power and your rights that just don't line up, and the two sides just can't match. In 1946, the Truman administration needs to react to this Stalin-style Soviet communism, where the United States, we embrace a policy which becomes known as, which is still the name we call it today, is containment. We don't want to actually fight a war against the Soviet Union. We think we could probably win it, but it would come at a huge cost of lives and of money. And so we instead want to make sure that the Soviet Union doesn't spread. We hope to contain communism. We don't think at this point we could end it, so we want to contain it. Europe then becomes divided into two political regions: a mostly democratic capitalist West and a basically united communist East. In March of 1946, Winston Churchill, he's not in office, but he's still a person of public figure. He travels the United States. He actually gives this speech in Missouri, right outside of St. Louis. Winston Churchill traveled to the United States and gave a speech that described the situation in Europe. He says, "A shadow has fallen upon the scenes so lately lighted by the Allied victory. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended against the continent. Behind that line lay all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in the Soviet sphere and are all subject in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and increasing measure of control from Moscow." Becomes known as the Iron Curtain that separates freedom from communism between the two sides of the continent. The phrase Iron Curtain would mean a lot to us in the West. Like, we would really see that that was a division that the other side just can't be like us. It came to stand for the division of Europe. And when Stalin heard the speech, he declared in no uncertain terms that Churchill was calling for war. Now, also worth noting that Churchill can't call for war. He's a out-of-work politician. But he says that this is going to be it. I love this cartoon over here. You got an angry person hanging over the Iron Curtain. Don't fence me in. The United States tried first to contain Soviet Union in Greece and Turkey. After World War II, Great Britain was trying to support both of these countries so that they wouldn't become communist. Basically, Greece and Turkey, their economies were a mess, and they figured that if they fell into economic chaos, that's exactly the kind of situation that communists thrive on. They're like, oh, look, capitalism failed. Come be communist and we'll go feed all of our people again. That's exactly the kind of rhetoric that they were afraid would catch on in Greece and Turkey. And so Great Britain had been propping up these countries, trying to send them aid. But, Great Britain fought the Battle of Britain. They had bombs fall in their own countries. Like they were broke. The United States emerged out of World War II as an economic powerhouse. Great Britain was not. Great Britain was pretty wrecked. And so Great Britain's economy had been badly hurt, and the formerly wealthy nation could no longer afford to give aid. It asked the United States to take over work in Greece and Turkey. Truman agreed, and on March 12, 1947, he asked Congress for a $400 million economic package and military aid package for Greece and Turkey. And in a statement which becomes known as the Truman Doctrine, he declared, this is a really important sentence here, "It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." He says America will defend freedom, and will defend it anywhere it comes up. And anybody who has their freedom threatened will find an ally in the United States. Harry Truman, when he lays out what becomes known as the Truman Doctrine, slams the door on the era of American isolationism. I think we've said a lot of times in this class that Americans tend to be isolationist. That we figure, hey man, those problems in Europe, that stinks. But they're not our problems. When Truman comes in and he says, anywhere that freedom is threatened, we got your back, the era of American isolationism is over. We're going to get involved in everybody's business from 1946 till this very moment we're living in. Like post-war Greece, Western Europe was in a lot of chaos. Most of its factories had been bombed or looted, and millions of people were living in refugee camps, far greater than the ability of any country to deal with them. In 1947, the United States Secretary of State, George Marshall, proposed that the United States should provide aid to all European countries that needed it. George Marshall says if we let all of these European countries just go like flail in the post-war era, they're all going to become communist. They're going to get it all. So the United States needs to go prop up any European country that needs it. His line was, he says, the move was not directed, it was directed not against any country or doctrine. We're not saying, don't listen to the Soviets, don't become communists. We're not saying that. George Marshall says, we're going to fight hunger and poverty and desperation and chaos. In a move that becomes known as the Marshall Plan, it revived European hopes. And over the next 4 years, 16 different countries received over $13 billion, and this is 1947 dollars, $13 billion in aid. And it's pretty successful. By 1952, Western Europe had mostly recovered. It was flourishing, and the Communist Party had lost its appeal. It looked like capitalism could work. And the Marshall Plan is successful. Today, this is not in your notes, today the term Marshall Plan usually refers to any kind of like a rebuilding effort. You'll hear this used all of the time. They'll say, we need a Marshall Plan for student debt. And it's supposed to be like some heroic way of swooping in and saving the day. The term the Marshall Plan comes out of it. But it's literally like, your country held a war and you're all screwed. Can I help you? Can I send you some cash and some Cheetos? Roman numeral number 3. As Europe recovered, the United States and its allies clashed with the Soviet Union over what to do with Germany. When Germany surrendered in World War II, we basically said, until we have a plan as to what to do with your country, we're going to separate into 4 quarters of the country. America's going to run this quarter, Soviet Union's going to roll this quarter, France, Great Britain. We'll put together your country eventually, but kind of in the meantime, well, we're going to keep the ball rolling. We're going to divide it into 4 zones. The Soviet Union would run this one in the east. By 1948, Great Britain and France and the United States had combined their 3 zones into one single country. It becomes known eventually as West Germany. To make this kind of complicated, the most important city in East Germany was Berlin. And in the western part of Berlin, that part remains under the control of the Americans. But it is surrounded by East Berlin and all the rest of the Soviet corner by Soviet-controlled land of what becomes known as East Germany. It was not supposed to be like this. This is kind of an accident of history, but this is how it goes down. The three nations intended to unify their zones, but they had no written agreement with the Soviet Union for how to handle West Berlin. They had no agreement for like, hey, as we're rebuilding the rest of Germany, the Soviets are like, yes, but we don't want to rebuild a capitalist-style democracy. We want to rebuild communism. And they're like, well, we're in West Berlin. But there just was no agreement for how West Berlin should be handled. You can tell, though, I mean, you don't have to be a geography major to tell West Berlin is hosed here, right? I mean, they're an enclave. They're totally surrounded. This becomes its own country, and part of this country is in the middle of somebody else's country. West Berlin actually belongs to West Germany, even though it's surrounded by East Germany. It's a small little enclave, and there was no way to reach it. Now, there was roads, and there were train lines that would go back and forth, but there's no agreement for how those roads and rails should be governed once they become two different countries. And so the Soviets, basically Stalin knows that if he moves fast enough, he can close the roads, close the rails, and he can sweat out West Germany and go get them too, and just make this a united East Germany and be a new satellite country for the Soviet Union. If he moved quickly, he could take over West Berlin. And in June of 1948, Stalin closed all the highways and all the rail routes into West Berlin. And as a result, West Berliners were stuck. They're like stuck on this island in the middle of it. And no food or fuel could reach that part of the city. And 2.1 million residents of the city have whatever food is in the city. Nothing's coming in or out. So there's food in the grocery stores until it's gone. The resulting situation was dire, and the Americans and British wanted to break the blockade. They began to use a technique of airplanes, because we have planes. It's 1948. This becomes called the Berlin Airlift. And we start flying flights over East Germany, but over West Berlin, and start dropping packages out of them. There's food, it's fuel, it's like Christmas presents. The pilots and flight crews, like when it comes time for Christmas, they're like, these people can't even get Christmas presents. So they like buy their own Christmas presents and they push them out of the airplane now. And these parachuting packages, just like the cartoons, right? Parachuting packages come sailing in to West Berlin. It's called the Berlin Airlift. And for 327 days, planes start taking off and flying over West Germany. And actually, this becomes a huge operation. There's like every 4 minutes a plane either lands or takes off. It's a huge operation and happened around the clock, 24 hours a day. And in 277,000 flights, they brought in 2.3 million tons of supplies. Food, fuel, medicine, Christmas presents. Actually, by the end of the Berlin Airlift, they were dropping in more supplies than ever reached West Berlin by the rail or the highways. They were getting more supplies than they had ever gotten before. And Stalin's like, well, damn, like the blockade had failed. And Stalin called off the blockade, realized it was beaten. I love this cartoon, or this ad. This is a magazine ad for Douglas airplanes. They make the airplanes here. And they say that milk becomes the weapon of democracy. That the Berlin Airlift, like, yes, they drop atomic bombs, but they also drop like milk and supplies. And they go feed this happy girl with her pigtails down here, that little German girl who loves milk. Subpoint C. That same month, the western part of Germany officially becomes a new country, the Federal Republic of Germany, including West Germany, including West Berlin. A few months later, officially East Germany becomes its country, and it includes East Berlin. You'll sometimes hear West Germany called the Bonn Republic because they have to, the capital becomes Bonn. Berlin's kind of the traditional capital, but Bonn becomes the capital of West Berlin at the time. Sometimes you hear it called the Bonn Republic or Bonn, Germany. The Berlin blockade increased the Western fear of Soviet aggression, and as a result, 10 Western European nations, Belgium, Denmark, France, Great Britain, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, and Portugal, they all joined with the United States and Canada on April 4th, 1949, to form a new defensive military alliance. Today we know it as NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The 12 members of NATO pledged military to support one another in case any member was attacked. What's fascinating about NATO is it's the first time that America joins a military alliance in a time of peace. There is no war. Like specifically, we don't need an alliance. We're not in a war. This is peacetime. I mean, it's the Cold War, but it's not really a war. Nobody's shooting at us. But we join a military alliance in a time of peace. Because the Cold War had ended any chance for us to return to isolationism. Greece and Turkey joined NATO in 1952. West Germany joined by 1955. And NATO kept a standing military force of 500,000 troops and tens of thousands of planes, tanks, and other equipment just ready to go if poop hits the fan. The Soviets also had one, and I think we'll hope to talk about this later. NATO becomes all of these dark blue countries. The Soviets have what's called the Warsaw Pact, and it's basically the communist version of it. It's all the dark red countries. The light blue countries are basically allies of the United States. The light red countries are socialist, they're communist countries allied with the Soviet Union. They're not a member of the Warsaw Pact, they're not a member of NATO, but they would be our natural allies. Have you ever heard the phrase, a first world country or a third world country? Nobody ever talks about what's a second world country. This is what they're talking about. It has nothing to do with economics, although it might. First world countries were basically the capitalist countries. Second world countries were the communist countries. We don't talk about second world countries because there's only a few communist countries left and they're mostly irrelevant. The third world are all the unallied countries, the ones that didn't have a side. So if you hear the third world country, it's not really just because they're the countries with malaria and they poop in holes or whatever, like you think of just like these economic wastelands. There is a surprising overlap with that, but that's not really what it's about. Yeah. Yes. So that's a first world, second world, third world. Third world just means unallied. It doesn't mean that they're broke and poor. You could be a first world country allied with the United States and be broke and poor. So that's good. Roman numeral number 4. For 2 decades, the Chinese communists fought against the nationalist government of this guy here on the left, a guy named Chiang Kai-shek. Okay, so a lot of years, China was in a civil war. Actually, even before World War II broke out, they were in more or less of a civil war, in a fight between 2 groups. It's basically the communists on one side, and the other side is called the nationalists. But basically they're the non-communists, right? The nationalists on one side, communists on the other. And Chiang Kai-shek is the leader of the nationalists. The United States supported Chiang. And between 1945 and 1945, the American government sent Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists about $3 billion in aid, and that's in 1945 dollars. This is a not small amount of help that we had done to try to prop up the Chinese nationalist government. Many Americans were pretty impressed by Chiang Kai-shek's bravery and his courage and the determination of Chinese nationalists during the war. It was the Chinese nationalists that resisted Japan from further incursions into the country. As the Japanese occupied Manchuria and what would be Peking and all of this, all the purple stuff here was Japanese occupation up to and during World War II. The nationalists control all of the green stuff. Basically, they become the wall that keep the Japanese from taking the rest of China. The red stuff are the communists, and there was a civil war between Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalists, and the communists, which are led by this guy over here, Mao Zedong. A lot of Americans were pretty impressed by this. However, if you were in the American government and you dealt with Chiang Kai-shek, you were less impressed with him if you kind of knew the details. On one sense, yes, I admire the bravery of the nationalists, but once you kind of see what the nationalists do, the luster comes off. It loses a little bit of its shine. U.S. officials who dealt with Chiang held a different view. They found his government, the government he was running, to be wildly inefficient and hopelessly corrupt. Yes, he's not communist, but it didn't seem like that was quite enough to really like the guy. Furthermore, policies of Chiang's government were all you have these new policies. You're like, dude, that's not how you try to run a government. You're hurting your own people. You're hurting your own people. The nationalists had a grain tax. If you're a farmer, China, you grow rice. That's your primary grain there. And they had a grain tax. A certain amount of it had to be given to the government. And China is not a rich country, and people often teeter on the brink of starvation, particularly in the 1940s. China is the sick man of Asia. It's just not an economically rich country. But Chiang Kai-shek increases the grain tax, and people that already don't have much have to give more and more. It's a time of famine. They're barely surviving, and Chiang increases the tax. City dwellers, people who don't live on the farms, they live in the urban areas. And even in the 1940s, there's a lot of people living in cities. They had to go pay the grain tax from the back end, and the actual price of buying rice. They saw in 1944 a 10,000% increase in the price of rice. Now, rice was cheap, but nobody can survive a 10,000% price increase. And even today, the main source of calorie in China is rice. And the grain is it. And Chiang Kai-shek's government appeared to just be screwing its own people. When city dwellers protested, and they say hey, government, quit screwing us over. They hold a protest. Chiang Kai-shek's secret police, he's got undercover cops. They opened fire on the demonstrators to kill the protesters. In contrast, the communists, led by Mao Zedong, gained strength throughout the country. In the areas that the communists controlled, they didn't raise the taxes on the peasants. They start to try to court their support, try to get the support of the poor. They encourage peasants to learn to read and go pick up education, and they help to improve food production, not just tax it. And as a result, more and more people said hey, who's solving my problems here? Chiang Kai-shek or the communists? Communism became very appealing. Mao Zedong did a great job of making it very appealing. And by 1945, a lot of northern China was just totally under Chinese communist control. And the Civil War erupted again in China between the two sides. In spite of nationalist problems, American containment policy, remember containment policy? Favored the nationalists. We favor Chiang Kai-shek because he's not communist. Even though his government is a total disaster, he's not communist. So the Americans support Chiang Kai-shek. And from 1944 to 1947, we try to play peacemaker between the two countries. Do you remember this graphic? I think we used it when we were introducing Stalin. People always ask, who's the guy on the right? Mao Zedong. Here's where he re-enters our storyline, or I guess enters it. Mao Zedong's a bad dude. I don't think it was clear to people at the time how much he was a bad dude. Mao Zedong's a bad dude. Civil war in China erupted between the two sides. In spite of nationalist problems, American containment policy favored them because they opposed communism. From 1944 to 1947, the U.S. played peacemaker, but repeatedly failed to negotiate peace. And in May of 1949, Chiang and whatever was left of the Nationalist Party fled China. Mao Zedong's Communist Army pushed him out, and he fled to the island of Taiwan. Taiwan is a Chinese island. You go to Taiwan today, they speak Chinese. The official name of Taiwan, if you go look it up in the book, the official name of Taiwan is the Republic of China. They think of themselves as Chinese. The Taiwanese actually think of themselves as the rightful rulers of China. They've just been ostracized. They're a government in exile. The communists shouldn't be there. They are the rightful rulers. They were the rulers before the revolution. They still rule here. Now, the Chinese states, Communist China, they look, this is the People's Republic of China. Republic of China, People's Republic of China. Same sound, similar sounding name. China considers Taiwan to still be their possession. They say that's not even a real country. That's a province. They call it a renegade province. They say it's a province in rebellion. It's a province that should be Chinese. And we will retake it one day. And this is still the position of China. They belong to us. I promise they're not a real country. Stop dealing with them. You deal with one united China. Everybody knows that Taiwan is its own country and they are not ruling over China. Everybody knows that China is not secretly ruled by Taiwan. Like, everybody knows these are two different countries. Yet if you ask each one of them, they're like, no, we're the rightful rulers and we run the other one. They don't. It's just like, okay, fine, dude, whatever. That's kind of the position of the world here. After more than 20 years of struggle, the communists ruled over all of mainland China, and they established a new government, the People's Republic. And the United States refused to accept it. We couldn't accept it. We'd had a containment policy. We were promising there's not going to be any more communist countries. And yes, it looks like Mao has taken control, but we're going to get it back. And that takes us to Roman numeral number 5. Korea. You might remember that Korea was run by the Japanese since the 19-teens. The Japanese took the province of Korea and they had run it. But you also might remember that Japan lost World War II. And so in August of 1945, Japanese troops who were occupying Korea surrendered. And they surrendered to our ally, the Soviet Union. In the north, all the Japanese troops in the north surrender to the Soviets. All the Japanese troops in the south surrender to the Americans. And right away, Korea, which is supposed to be its own country, we right away know that Korea is going to be its own country, immediately gets divided, kind of like what happened in Germany, where they surrendered to the Soviets in the north. The Soviets set up a communist-style provisional government. In the South, where they surrendered to the Americans set up a capitalist-style provisional government. They're both supposed to be temporary. They're both supposed to, take over the whole of the country one day. And as the war ended, troops surrendered north of the 38th parallel, the 38th north line of latitude. And as in Germany, two countries developed, one communist and one democratic. In 1948, the Republic of Korea, South Korea, the Republic of Korea was established in the zone occupied by the United States. Its government was based in Seoul, which is kind of Korea's traditional capital. The communists formed the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north, led by their leader, a guy named Kim Il-sung. And they set up its government in the new capital of Pyongyang. Soon after World War II, the United States cut back its armed forces in South Korea, and by June of 1949, there was only 500 American troops there. The Soviets looked at South Korea and they said there's 500 Americans in South Korea. It's like nobody's watching the store. I think we can unite this country right now. And the Soviets concluded that the United States didn't actually care about the Koreans, and that if the Soviets moved in, they could just take the whole country. They wouldn't even fight to defend it. They prepared to back North Korea with tanks and airplanes and money, and they began to take over the peninsula. When they start to do that, 16 countries send over 500,000 troops to go prop up South Korea. 90% of these troops were Americans. South Korean troops numbered an additional Kim Il-sung's also on this chart. It makes it look pathetic, doesn't it? Like, come on. You call yourself a dictator. You're a poor tater. Guess I shouldn't laugh about that. That's not an okay thing to laugh about. We send in 500,000 troops. The South Koreans send in 590,000 troops, even more than us, under the command of our old friend, General Douglas MacArthur. The biggest, baddest apple, the B-est A, the baddest apple of the Pacific, goes to lead the defense of South Korea against the Soviets, against the intrusions from the north. At first, it looked like North Korea was just going to run through the country. It looked like North Korea was going to go win the South easily, without even really trying very much. Its troops captured all the way down to Seoul. So North Korea had come all the way down and had captured the capital of Seoul. MacArthur then launched a counterattack, and on September 15th of 1950, his troops made a surprise amphibious landing. North Koreans didn't see it coming. A surprise landing behind the lines at Incheon, which is Incheon. I don't see it. Maybe it's a different spelling on this map. They're not English names, so sometimes the spelling's different. Other troops moved north from Pusan, which is down here, and they go and they do the surprise attack, and basically half the North Korean troops surrender, being surrounded on both sides by Americans and South Koreans, and the rest fled back across the 38th parallel, and basically MacArthur is able to push back the Soviet incursion back up to the north and saved his army from an almost certain defeat. The UN then chased the retreating North Korean troops all the way across the 38th parallel into North Korea, and by late November of 1950, UN troops approached the Yalu River on the border between North Korea and China. This is the Yalu River up here, and basically we began pushing the Soviets all the way out of North Korea. By force of numbers, the Chinese are also communist, and by 1950 they're ready to go see a stronger communist neighbor. The Chinese start pushing UN troops southward, and it's no longer about the Soviets anymore. We basically pushed the Soviets out of the game, and now the Americans are fighting the Chinese communists. And there, the Chinese drove the UN troops southward, and by early of 1951, all the UN and South Korean troops got pushed out of North Korea. The Chinese then advanced again to the south, capturing Seoul, and for 2 years, Korea ends up in a stalemate, that nothing's happening. Neither side was able to make advance. I shouldn't say nothing's happening, there's still a war going on, but neither side was able to gain ground. To break the stalemate, MacArthur in 1951 said, you know how we go and win this war? We're fighting the Chinese now. Let's take the war to China. If we can go distract Mao's armies, they'll stop fighting in North Korea. They'll pull their troops northward to go defend the mainland, and then we'll have Korea then. They'll pull out of Korea. Like, we need to go attack China. That's really the battlefront we need to be doing. Remember, MacArthur is this brilliant military genius. He's like, he lost troops. People died, but like the enemy lost 10 times as many troops as MacArthur. The man's a military genius. And he called for an extension war into China, and let's go take this fight into the cities. Truman says, MacArthur, no. we're not going there. You were not going to take this into the city. Truman rejected MacArthur's request. Did I miss a line on this one? I did. Okay. South Korea escalating war, mandatory Chinese America. So MacArthur, so he's like, no, Douglas, we're not going to go pick a new war against the most populous nation on earth against China. We're not going to do that. MacArthur's like, dude, atomic bombs. Like, we could, come on. We could do this. And Truman's like, no, we're not going to go dropping atomic bombs on it. We're not attacking China. We're not using nuclear weapons. Instead of attacking China, the UN and South Korean forces stuck to traditional warfare and began advancing again. And by April of 1951, they did retake Seoul, and they had again moved the communists back up to the 38th parallel. And it's like, after all of these years of war and all the people that got killed, they were back where they started, with two independent countries respecting the 38th parallel as the line dividing the two of them. MacArthur says, I'm correct. He's like, I don't care what the president says. He says, I'm correct. And he tried to go over the president's head and make popular appeals. He started speaking and writing private letters, and he's just appearing in the press, and he gets members of Congress, and he's like, no, you look for like Republican members of Congress because Truman's a Democrat, and you're like, no, we can turn this into a political fight. And he starts like rallying up congressmen, and MacArthur doesn't get to make this call. The president is the commander-in-chief. MacArthur is a general, but he takes orders from the president. There's this weird thing about America that the army doesn't lead itself. The president is a civilian, the civilians lead the army. And a lot of countries don't have that, and MacArthur just wouldn't accept it. MacArthur had no authority to make policy decisions. That's the job of the president. He's the commander-in-chief. They keep saying, MacArthur, stop this. You're not agitating for a greater war. Like, that's not your job. That's not what we're going to do. MacArthur continued to criticize the president. Harry Truman was just as stubborn as MacArthur, and he basically refused to accept it. He says, Douglas MacArthur is an American hero and maybe the greatest military general of our day. But if he doesn't respect orders, we can't have him. And Truman fired MacArthur. It shocked America. I don't know of anybody more respected in the United States than Douglas MacArthur. The man was seen as a brilliant leader of men, and Truman fired him. And Americans were like, "Whoa, that seems like a lot. We might need him." Public opinions showed that 70% of Americans supported MacArthur. MacArthur came back to the United States. He gave an address to Congress, usually something that's like heroes get a chance to address Congress. The city of New York threw a parade for him. He got a ticker tape parade for a fired guy, and he came home. But he returned as like everybody's favorite hero. In his closing remarks to Congress, MacArthur delivers one of his most famous lines. We know him from like, I shall return, and people of the Philippines, I have returned. He gives what becomes maybe his most enduring lines. He says, old soldiers never die. They just fade away. Public opinion eventually came around to Truman. The longer that we stayed fighting in Korea and took on other battles, the less America, we'd lost our appetite for that kind of scale of war. And public opinion eventually came around to say maybe Truman did do the right thing, unpopular as it was. Maybe it was the right thing. And as a political figure, MacArthur did just fade away. By the time he did die, he was pretty much irrelevant to the rest of America. The Soviet Union surprised us in June of 1951 by suggesting a ceasefire in Korea. They began truce talks in 1951, and both sides were able to reach an agreement on the location of the ceasefire to where they would stop fighting each other. And it was the 38th parallel, where they would set up what becomes known as a demilitarized zone, the DMZ, where neither side would go bring weapons. There would be they weren't going to go advance past the demilitarized zone in the 38th parallel. It's important to remember that this is not a peace treaty. It's a ceasefire and it's an armistice. An armistice is an agreement to stop shooting at each other, but it's not peace. On paper, the Korean War actually still exists. North Korea and South Korea are still in a perpetual state of war. They've just agreed not to shoot at each other. There have been a couple of skirmishes here and there. Both sides are ready for it to go down if it does go down. But they've agreed to stop shooting. In July of 1953, both sides signed an armistice. It was at best a stalemate. On one hand, the North Korean invaders had been pushed back and communism had been contained. Mission accomplished. And they did it without the use of atomic weapons. On the other hand, they never did unite Korea. It still remains to this day two different countries. On the home front, Americans looked at the Korean War, and it affected the lives of ordinary Americans. It cost 54,000 American lives, $67 billion in expenditures. The high cost of the unsuccessful war was one of many factors leading Americans to say, you know what, the Democratic Party, it's too expensive for too much nothing. And in 1952, they elected a Republican, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower, the hero of the European theater, actually had no politics before running for 1952. He wasn't sure what political party he belonged to. Both sides convinced him, like, oh yeah, you're a Democrat. Oh yeah, you're a Republican. Became a Republican. In addition, the Korean War increased the fear of communist aggression and prompted a hunt for Americans who might be blamed for any communist gains.